After considering what to do about the question Dylan had raised, Angelica said, "We should investigate the skull before we come to any conclusions." They began their way downhill towards the skull, when suddenly a loud howling sound pierced their ears, coming from the direction of the skull. With no other warning, dark, enormous, chaotic clouds of sand came rushing wildly towards them from straight ahead. "Sandstorm!" Dylan shouted, as he whipped out the tarp from Angelica's pack. He quickly jabbed arrows into 3 corners of the tent. Propping up the corner opposite of the storm with his bow, he prompted Angelica to get inside, and they both rolled under just as a wall of sand plummeted down over them. The improvised tent flapped furiously, threatening to lose all protective capabilities. So Dylan transformed into a bird and tucked Angelica under his wing, protecting her from the weight that he knew would soon come. The heavy wind brought the sand in sheets, rapidly burying them in sand. Angelica didn't feel the weight of the sand, and without realizing it, eventually fell asleep, nestled in Dylan's flank. It took a significant effort for Dylan to keep in enough air and not collapse under the crushing weight of the sand. Just as Dylan was losing hope, the storm finally subsided, and he was able to crawl them out from under their shelter. All was calm outside, and Dylan sighed in relief. Transforming back into a squirrel, he dug out his bow and his tarp, but the arrows he'd used were not retrievable. Luckily, the tarp hadn't received too much damage, so Dylan shook it off and rolled it up and put it back on Angelica's pack. Angelica awoke. Realizing the heroic effort that Dylan had made in saving them both from the sandstorm, she stroked him gently on the beak. "Thank you for saving us," Angelica said. "If it hadn't been for your quick thinking and courage, we would have been dead in the storm." "I'm glad that I was able to save us," he said, "but I'm afraid I've lost track of our heading. I'll fly up and see where we need to go. It shouldn't be too far off now. Follow me when I find direction." Transforming back into a bird, he flew up into the sky, circling until he was able to see where the skull was. Slowly, he began to fly in its direction and looked down behind him to make sure that Angelica was following him. She was. Soon enough, he finally reached the skull and hovered over it, perplexed, because from above he really couldn't see any ruins at all. By this time, Angelica had the skull in her view, and she made out a dark hollow under its jaws. She ran towards it and shouted, "Inside the skull! The entrance to the ruins Nadre told us about." Dylan could hardly make out what she was saying, so he decided to land. Once he sat down on the ground, he turned back into a squirrel and had a look for himself. In the gaping jaw of the sun-bleached skull, there was an entrance to a flight of stairs, which led downwards into the dark abyss below. It was the first sign of shade for a day or two, aside from the unwelcome shade that the sandstorm had brought. Angelica caught up to Dylan. Together, they entered the refreshingly cool shade. Though dank air lingered inside the skull, it felt good for them now because they could finally step out of the scorching sun. At the top of the stairs, they found a blaze-emitting stone embedded in the wall. Dylan said, "This is an elderstein. It isn't big, but it offers enough flame to ignite a torch, which we will be able to carry down into the stairwell. Down the stairwell, that is." After taking a torch mounted on the wall opposite the stone, he walked to the elderstein and lit the torch's head. The elderstein, which quickly lit the torch head ablaze, intrigued Angelica. She wondered whether it could be dismounted. Then she realized that even if it could be, it wasn't big, and she decided to look for a better one later. "Well, where did elderstein naturally originate?" she asked. "Do you know?" "Brimhager, which is a volcano that stands to the northeast of the Frostpeak mountain range. Dylan explained. The volcano always generates an elderstein when it erupts. Claim on the stone is usually contested because the eruptions don't occur often enough to make the stone universally available. The stone here must have been a piece of a larger stone broken off manually by whoever mounted it on this wall, or it could have been one of the side products when an eruption occurred. Normally, the elderstein that is produced by the event is much larger. He led the way down the stairs, lighting coals and braziers, which were mounted on either side periodically along the way. As they descended farther into the dark, musty stairway, the noticeably cooler air made the heat of the desert outside seem like a lie to them. It appears that the only warmth we'll find here is the heat from that torch, Angelica remarked. Aye, the same goes for light, Dylan answered, staring down into the black emptiness below. These confounded snakes built their city deep. Just when they were beginning to think that they would be descending the stairwell forever, a golden gateway towered on either side before them, and at the same time the ceiling drew further away from them. Beyond the entry, an incredibly spacious chamber spread out before them. Dylan said, "It looks like we've finally arrived in the ancient ruins that Nadre asked us to visit. What relic does he want us to discover in the home of his people?" As they stepped out onto the cobblestone floor, Dylan noticed an interesting choice in flooring for such a deeply crafted city. I might have thought the city would have been simply carved directly from the bedrock at most. Angelica laughed. She was embarrassed because she knew nothing of masonry or any other craft. "You know much more than I do of the world," she said. "I envy you." He replied, "You will come to know these sorts of things as we journey through the different lands and encounter many different circumstances." In the darkness of the hall, they could only faintly make out the large shapes of Herpoesquirrel and statues on either side in front of them. Some smaller statues had a more familiar squirrel shape. Two stone snakes lay stretched out along the floor, weaving between the statues, from the far end of the room to the near. On closer inspection, both snake statues had coals in their mouths, like the coals in the braziers of the stairwell behind them. Dylan said, "Even with the light behind us, it's quite dark down here. Perhaps we should see if there's a way to better light the place." He walked towards the snake on the left side and lighted the coals inside the mouth with the torch. Almost instantly, the flame raced along the spine of the stone snake to the tip of its tail, and onward to the top of an enormous Herpoesquirrel-shaped pyramid. It was an eerie green flame, different from the flame that the torch had emitted. Keep making mistakes. Oh well. The greenish light was bright enough for navigating the hall, but it seemed a waste not to light the other side as well. So Dylan lit the coals in the other snake's mouth. Just as quickly as the first snake, the snake on the right side resplendently burst into flame, filling that half of the spacious room with purple-tinted light. The two colors mingled and clashed at the center of the hall, filling it with a grayish light that interacted strangely with the surfaces of the room. Something began to shine brightly inside the enormous Herpoesquirrel in Pyramid's mouth. They were too far away to make what it was. Angelica had her eyes fixated on this new shining object. She stood motionless, staring for minutes, until suddenly she began walking forward at a brisk pace. "Let us go towards the pyramid," she said, in a voice surprisingly void of emotion, as if she were in a trance. Dylan grew worried for her sake, because she had never behaved like this. Her unwavering assent towards the gleaming object seemed unusual. Until now, Angelica always had been talkative and warm. Everything that she had said and done seemed to make sense to him. But now she did not appear to be in control of her body. He ran after her, making several attempts to stop her. He even grabbed her arm and tried to pull her back. But she cast his hand aside with unexpected strength. "What has come over you?" he cried out. "You must stop this ridiculous behavior at once." Angelica didn't hear a word Dylan said. A loud humming sound inside her head seemed to beckon her towards the radiant artifact, which lay in the mouth of the gigantic Herpoesquirrel pyramid. Her ability to think for herself was gone. For whatever reason, putting her hands on the object was the only thing that she could envision herself doing. She walked up the stairs in an unmatchable pace, and she set her eyes on the artifact, which rested on the tongue of the gaping pyramid's mouth. The feeling that she was meant to touch it was impossible to ignore. She began to reach for it. Why has Nedre led them to this place and directed them to investigate this artifact? Pondered Dylan. What was he planning, and what would it do to them? "Stop, Angelica," he called as he nearly caught up with her. "We have no idea whether that thing is safe to touch." He was about to grab Angelica and attempt to force her away from the object by any means necessary, when he too began to hear a sound resonating from a multicolored cluster of stones that seemed to be alive, begging for someone to take it into their hands. Dylan himself began struggling with his consciousness, though he wasn't nearly as affected as Angelica was. His urgent need to stop Angelica seemed to fade away from his mind, as he too began to walk without control towards the unusual cluster of stones that rested on the statue's tongue before them. Mustering all his remaining willpower, with his last conscious thought, he made a final effort to try and stop Angelica. By the time he could reach far enough forward to have any chance at all, it was too late. Angelica suddenly thrust out her hand to touch the object, just when she came within reach of it. Alright, I'll record more of this as soon as I can. Thanks for listening.